Good morning, Year 5. We're actually moving on to a new topic today. I'm going to be focusing on decimals. So, here on the board, that cube there represents one whole. Okay? So that's one whole there. And that one whole is made up of 1,000 thousandths. Okay, so there's 1,000 parts to it, and I've got 1,000. That's why I've got one whole. So on my place value square here, I just write 1 there. But what if I have just one part of it, one part of the whole? Well then I've got 1 out of 1,000. And I call that a thousandth. Well, there's another way of writing that fraction. I can write that fraction as a decimal fraction. So it's 0.001. It's 1,000th. They're said exactly the same. 1,000th, 1,000th. Because they're equivalent to each other. They're exactly the same. That's a fraction, that's a decimal fraction. And remember what a fraction is. A fraction is a part of the whole. So here, again, on my place value grid, well, I've got 0 ones. Put my decimal point in there. I've got no tenths at all. I've got no hundredths and just 1,000th. So these squares, if I continued to count up the squares, I'd have 1,000th, 2,000ths, 3,000ths, 4,000ths, 5,000ths, 6,000ths, 7,000ths, 8,000ths, 9,000ths. But what happens when I get to 10? Do I write it like this? 0 ones, 0 tenths, 0 hundredths, and then 1,000th there with another 0 just added at the end. Well, no. If I cross that out, you'll notice that the value of this decimal fraction here is exactly the same to that. So let's see what happens. Well, there it is now. I've got 10 thousandths. Well, I can actually simplify this fraction by dividing by 10. So if I divide by 10, I end up with 1/100th. Okay? So, as a fraction, I write it as 1/100th. So how do I write that then as a decimal fraction? Well, let's take a look at our place value grid here. I have 0 ones. So I've got no whole numbers, I've only got part of the whole. Put my decimal point in. I've got no tenths, but I have got 1/100th. Okay? I could put the 0 in for thousandths, but there's no point because it has no value and it's not a placeholder. I can call this 1/100th, or I can actually still call it 10 thousandths. Okay? So that's 1/100th, but it's also 10 thousandths. So, again, I do the same thing here. I count along. 200ths, 300ths, 400ths, 500ths, 600ths, 700ths, 800ths, 900ths. Well, what happens when I get to 10 hundredths? Let's take a look. So there it is. There's my 10 hundredths. I can write this a couple of ways actually. I'll come back to that. But it's 10 hundredths from the way we've been counting. Well, again, I can simplify this by dividing by 10. So, that is now 1/10. I could call it 1/10. Well, let's look how we write 1/10 as a decimal fraction. Do I have a whole number? No, I don't. 0 there. Decimal point. I've got 1/10. And remember, I don't have to put that 0 in because it's not a placeholder. But I can also call this 10/100ths. I can also call it something else. Put another 0 in there. It's actually 100,000ths, isn't it? I'd have 100,000ths there. So I could write it as a fraction like that. Okay? So then, what happens then with my tenths? Well, I've got 10/10ths here. So we've got 1/10, 0.1, 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10. Well, what happens when I get to 10/10ths? Well, hopefully you can see there's 10/10ths there. That's exactly the same, if I was to push it tighter together, as the whole there. So 10/10ths is the same as 1 whole. And remember, let's go back, cast our minds back to September, and we spoke again and again about the power of 10. Each time you get 10, you move up to the next column. So 10,000ths would make 100th. 10/100ths makes 1/10th. 10/10ths makes 1 whole. Okay, it's the power of 10. So here, you're going to be asked questions like this today. Can you write what number is represented here? So I'd start with the largest. Well, that there, that's 1 whole because it's 1,000 thousandths. So I can write that in. I have 1 whole. And the rest of these are parts to the whole. Well, how many do I have here? This is the next largest. So I've actually got there these must be my tenths, okay? Well, if I was to actually count it up, I actually have 1/10 there, okay? I've got 1/10, 100 hundredths. So that can go after my decimal point, there. And then, what are these here? These must be my hundredths. So how many of those do I have? 1, 2, 3. 3 hundredths. And then these two here, if you remember, they're just worth thousandths. So they're 2 thousandths. Be careful, I do not say this number as 1.132. They are not worth 132. They are decimal fractions. They're only parts of the whole. So it's 1.132 is how we say that. If I look here now, well, I can't see 1,000 anywhere. So I've got no whole numbers there. Okay. But I can see tenths. 1 lot of 10, 2 tenths. There are no hundredths anywhere. But there are 1, 2, 3 thousandths. Okay, so that number is 0.203. I could even call it 203 thousandths. Okay. Best of luck with that today. Make sure you look at the task first before joining us on Google Classroom. Best of luck.